ready?
Yeah, ready to go.
Okay. Okay. All right, well, we're going to get started today. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Amy Dalrymple with the North Dakota Monitor, and I want to first thank Dakota Media Access for hosting us in this great space and also recording it for us. But I'm pleased to introduce Matt Korda. He is an associate director for the Nuclear Information Project at the Federation of American Scientists. He co authors Nuclear Notebook, an authoritative open source estimate of global nuclear forces and trends. And Matt is traveling through Western states to meet with reporters. So we're grateful that we have a lot of Bismarck area reporters here to join to hear from Matt. And these sessions are supported by the Outrider Foundation and the Carnegie Corporation of New York. So thank you for being here, and I'll turn it over to Matt.
Great. Thank you so much, Amy. Thank you all for being here. Thanks for having me in this great space. As Amy mentioned, my name is Matt Korda. I'm the Associate Director for the Nuclear Information Project at the Federation of American Scientists. And FAS, we're based in Washington, D.C., but I'm based in Toronto, so kind of coming from a few different spots here. But FAS, the goal really of what we do, we're one of the oldest nuclear policy organizations in the world. And what we do is we use open sources, so things like satellite imagery, which we'll talk about in a little bit, budgetary information, Freedom of Information Act requests, things like that, to try and put together the best unclassified information about global nuclear forces and trends. And the goal, and the reason why we do that is because we want to empower journalists, the public, folks like yourselves, policymakers, lawmakers, really anyone that can use this information to try and understand shifts in nuclear policy, to try and communicate trends to the public and to other folks that you're engaging with, and to really to advocate for smarter nuclear policy, whatever that policy is. And so we've been doing this work for about 30 years at FAS, in particular. That's how long the Nuclear Information Project has been there. And really the main reason why we do this is that a lot of nuclear-armed countries don't like to talk about their nuclear weapons for perhaps obvious reasons. But from our perspective, there is really not that much about nuclear weapons that needs to be kept secret, right? Obviously, there are a few things, right? You don't want to publicize how to build a nuclear weapon, right? You don't want that information getting into the wrong hands. You may not want to publicize, the security measures that are being taken to that countries are using to guard their nuclear weapons. Probably not a great idea. But things like nuclear budgets, arsenals and stockpiles, things like that affect US taxpayers, that affect people who live near nuclear weapons, those things should be made public. And because nuclear weapons do affect all of us, right, whether they go off or not, it's important for people to be aware of what's going on in the nuclear space. And so we try and make that information public in a responsible way. And we also, just in this new environment in which there's so much disinformation, right, in social media, things like that, we recognize that by injecting factual information into the landscape, it helps push back against things like misinformation, disinformation, and sort of pushes back against that vacuum that opens up whenever you don't have factual information as part of the debate. So that's really why I'm here today. I'm sort of making this route and traveling throughout various states across the country that host US nuclear weapons. This is my first time doing this, which I'm very excited about. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation and to hear from you guys about your perspectives as well. And so I have a short talk prepared, maybe about like somewhere between 20 and 30 minutes, and then I'm looking forward to opening it up to discussion and just hearing from you guys if you have any questions, things like that. So I'm going to start by zooming out and talking about the sort of evolving global nuclear landscape, just to put what I'm about to say afterwards into context. And we'll talk about US nuclear transparency and opacity, trends in US nuclear policy and posture, and then we're going to talk about the Sentinel ICBM, which is sort of the big thing for North Dakota in particular and across the states that I'm going to, and what's next for the state. So that's where we will kick it off. The first trend that I want to talk about is the growth of global nuclear stockpiles. So this is a chart that we prepare, we make updates to it constantly. And really what you can see from this, this is based on our estimates using open sources. You can see that the United States and Russia possess approximately 90% of all nuclear weapons in the world. And what's interesting is that that percentage is actually shrinking. And it's not because US and Russian nuclear stockpiles are getting smaller. It's actually the opposite, right? It's that other countries' nuclear arsenals are growing. And so they constitute increasingly this sort of larger piece of the pie. So to highlight a few countries in particular, we have China, which is undergoing the largest and fastest expansion of its nuclear arsenal in the country's history. The UK recently sort of announced that it was going to be shifting from decades of gradual disarmament towards potentially increasing its stockpile. We have Pakistan and India, who are sort of in direct competition with each other and slowly are increasing their arsenals. And we have North Korea, which is also pretty quickly increasing its nuclear arsenal as well and experimenting with lots of different types of delivery systems. Yeah?
Sorry to interrupt, Matt.
No, not at all.
What counts as one unit? Is it like one single weapon, or?
Yes.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
Based on our best estimates using open sources. But yeah, these numbers refer to the number of nuclear weapons in those countries' arsenals. And really every single country on this list is doing what they would refer to as modernizing their nuclear arsenals. And what do I mean by modernizing? It means that they are either qualitatively increasing the characteristics and the capabilities of their weapons, so just upgrading them so that they're more capable, or they are quantitatively increasing their stockpiles. And some countries are actually doing both. Right? And we can talk about that in a little bit. And the modernization programs are going to keep nuclear weapons in these countries' arsenals for at least the next 50 to 70 years. And we'll talk again a little bit about how the world is going to change in 50 to 70 years and how that might implicate some of these countries. So let's talk about transparency. So the US is, we're missing a, first thing, that first line is supposed to say the US is generally speaking the most transparent country in the world when it comes to nuclear weapons. Oh, there we go. And along with France, it's the only state that has ever actually disclosed the exact number of nuclear warheads in its stockpile, which is a really welcome move that we applaud whenever it does happen. It typically happens partially as a result of declassification requests that we at FAS make to the Department of Energy and the State Department, and also these are things that, there's a significant interagency discussion that happens about when is appropriate to disclose that, and we love it whenever it does happen. Also, I mentioned open sources that we use. A lot of information can be derived from official documents, right? The U.S. is quite an open country, right? And so it has to publish things like budgets, environmental impact statements, which we will talk about a lot because those are great sources of information, congressional testimony, reports to Congress, that sort of thing. Additionally, the U.S. has a robust media landscape. You are all here that can hold governments to account and ask questions, as well as civil society organizations like FAS that can use open sources to verify information independently. On top of that, the U.S. is, I sort of put like a was, because we're in a bit of a gray area right now, party to arms control treaties that require public data disclosure. The U.S. is, at least on paper, party to the New START Treaty. This is a treaty that is the last bilateral strategic arms treaty between the U.S. and Russia. It is going to expire in February of 2026. Unfortunately, neither the United States nor Russia is really complying with the treaty at the moment. Russia sort of stopped complying around the time of the war in Ukraine. The U.S. took what it calls reciprocal countermeasures and then also similarly stopped complying. So they are still complying with the actual limits of the treaty, which indicate how many warheads they're allowed to deploy, but they are not really providing public data disclosure. So that's the part that we're really missing, this transparency element. We are seeing some positive trends, right? So I mentioned the U.S. recently declassified its stockpile size and the number of dismantled warheads. So that was something that they did in 2023. It was fantastic. And as well, during the previous administration, there was some concern, generally speaking, in public debates about, is the U.S. going to restart nuclear explosive testing? And so what the administration wanted to do was to show we are not going to be restarting that. And so they actually invited civil society and journalists out to the Nevada test site to demonstrate, this is not something that we're going to do. We're going to show off our modeling and simulation equipment to demonstrate that, we don't need to go back to explosive testing. We're perfectly fine doing things in a modeling way. So we'll see whether that continues under this administration, but that was certainly a positive trend that we've seen over the past few years. Some negative trends. The US does tend to needlessly overclassify things. This happens in a lot of countries. It's not just the US, but we see that, generally speaking, officials and agencies will sort of feel that it's safer to overclassify something rather than underclassify something. And so we tend to miss out on a lot of information that we believe should be public because of that. We've also seen that in certain instances, documents have been scrubbed after we've reported on them or other folks have reported on them. Here's a great example in which we reported a few years ago that the US was planning on reestablishing its nuclear mission in the United Kingdom for the first time in 15 years. And we found this out partially because there was a line in this FY 2023 budget that said the UK. It included the UK amongst a list of other countries that the US was planning on upgrading storage sites. And then we reported on it. And then the following year's budget, all the country names were removed. So we see this sort of back and forth thing that happens. And this is now, well established that the US is going to be reestablishing this mission. So you might ask yourself, why does the US feel the need to hide country names in this way? I don't really know. It's unfortunate. But so we see sometimes these negative trends. Then some sort of question mark neutral trends. We're seeing a lot more public displays of nuclear signaling. So things like bomber overflights, surfacing ballistic missile submarines in places where typically the US, in previous years would never say where their nuclear ballistic missile submarines are. Now we're starting to see news stories that come out of DoD that say like, a submarine has surfaced in this ocean or in this, and they're conducting a visit. That's interesting. That never used to happen before. It's all part of this sort of signaling to allies and adversaries, but it does mean that I guess it's positive from the sense of we get more information. Perhaps it's negative in the sense of maybe this has the potential to ratchet up, tensions. Depends on how you look at it. So I call that sort of a neutral trend. I've put together this little map here, which sort of gives you a sense of the geographic spread of U.S. nuclear weapons, like pieces of the enterprise across the country. So Minot is the only one actually that has kind of this like unique color. That's because it doesn't have its own color. It has a bomber base and an ICBM base, so it's sort of melded together into this weird brown color. It's the only base like that across the country.
Matt, does Minot have missiles at the base, or does it control missiles throughout North Dakota?
The second one. So it has, presumably there's some like storage equipment and things like that at the base, but you'll actually see I have in a subsequent slide, there's a map of the Minot missile field, and you'll see it's sort of like in this L half horseshoe shape that goes around the base. So we'll get that a little bit closer on. But you can see, otherwise we have bomber missions that are current, right? So, for example, at Whiteman, at Offutt, at Mountain Home, Barksdale. There's also future ones that are going to be established at Ellsworth, at Dyess in Texas. And then we sort of have the bits of the nuclear weapons complex as well. Also, to supplement this, I put together this sort of nuclear weapons by location, along with our best estimates as to how this, like what the geographic spread is here. And so you can see the largest nuclear weapons storage site in the country, and really likely on the planet, is in New Mexico at the Kirtland Underground Munitions and Maintenance Storage Complex. This is just a massive, massive storage site with a ton of nuclear weapons there. That's where a lot of things tend to be stored. Then you have the two nuclear ballistic missile submarine bases, one in Washington and Georgia. And then North Dakota comes in fourth on the list, right, because it has both the ICBM mission and the bomber mission. And then sort of going down from there, we've got Montana, Missouri, Texas, Nebraska. And then because the silos across F.E. Warren are concentrated between 3 states, we have sort of this breakdown, as well as some in Europe. So let's talk a little bit about some trends, right? So one thing that we're seeing is that, previously, during the Cold War especially, there was this trend towards continuously producing new warheads for the stockpile, right? So the US was developing new warheads, they were designing new warheads, that sort of thing. Once the Cold War ended, this sort of shifted, right? The mission itself shifted away from building new warheads and instead towards sort of sustainment and what the US called stewardship of the existing and diminishing stockpile, right? So there was much more of this interest in just making sure that the stockpile was safe and secure, and not necessarily building entirely new warheads. This also sort of coincided with a general pullback of US nuclear weapons from around the globe, diminishing the stockpile, that sort of thing, especially because new arms control agreements were coming into effect. And so as a result of that focus on stewardship, the US had not designed and developed a new warhead since 1992 until now, right? So we are now seeing this sort of new generation of brand new warheads that are going to be brought into the stockpile. And this is part of a suite of modernization efforts, that word that I mentioned earlier, that are wrapped up into what's called the program of record. And the program of record, has a ton of different components. As part of it involves a lot of different warhead programs, which we'll talk about. But one of the largest challenges of previous administrations, this current administration, future administrations, is going to be about executing the program of record in a manner that's on time and on budget, which is going to be very complicated. So, as part of this, right, the US is life extending, upgrading, or replacing nearly every single nuclear weapon, launch platform, and delivery system in its arsenal, along with command and control systems. And so by my count, this includes at least 7 simultaneous warhead programs, so 4 for the Air Force and 3 for the Navy, 2 aircraft programs, 2 ICBM programs, 2 submarine programs, 1 submarine-launched ballistic missile program, and now 1 submarine-launched cruise missile program as well. Can that be done? Sure, but clearly not without significant delays and budgetary overruns, which are happening basically across every leg of the triad. And a key theme that I want to point out here is that whenever you have a big delay like that, which pushes an individual system's timeline more to the right, you get this sort of ripple effect that means that you have to life extend current systems, you have to sort of mess around with other timelines, and it does sort of create this like domino effect in which lots of different things get pushed. And so that's really something that we're seeing here. Nowhere, I think, is this more evident than with the Sentinel ICBM, which is kind of the main focus of what's been going on in North Dakota. You can see right here, that's the geographic distribution across North Dakota. You have this kind of like tilted horseshoe shape. So the Sentinel program is this like-for-like replacement, right, of all existing Minuteman III missiles that are currently deployed in 450 silos across 5 states, plus upgrades to the launch facilities, launch control centers, and other supporting infrastructure. And it sort of seems like every month or every few months, we get this sort of new update as to how there is a new challenge that is happening with Sentinel. It is either experiencing cost overruns or delays or poor performance or mismanagement or something else. And at the beginning of 2024, this really became big news when the Pentagon announced that Sentinel had been a material breach or critical breach of the Nunn-McCurdy Act, which is an act that's designed to basically try and keep programs within budget and within schedule. And so you are in breach of the Nunn-McCurdy Act when you're over 25% beyond the program baseline. Sentinel at that time hit 37%. It is now at 81%. So this is kind of where we're at. And no matter sort of how you approach this issue, whether you are someone who wants to see the US execute its modernization program very well, and you want to see more nuclear weapons, enter the arsenal, or if you're someone who's really interested in disarmament, this is something that everyone should be aware of, something that everyone should be concerned about, because at the end of the day, it's going to be taxpayers and folks across the country who are going to have to bear the costs of a program that is being mismanaged and having this many challenges in this way. So this is why it's really no accident that when the new president came in, he put out this new sort of executive order in April of 2025, and he said, basically, any program that is more than 15% behind schedule or 15% over cost is going to be scrutinized for cancellation. And Sentinel was specifically mentioned in this fact sheet that they put out. And they wrote it's already 2 years behind schedule and 37% more expensive than originally promised. And so I don't think they're wrong about this, right? This is throughout this process, and we'll talk a little bit about how we got to where we are. with Sentinel, but goalposts have been continuously moved. Benchmarks have been sort of cherry-picked to allow for sort of making it seem like the program was achievable at a low cost when really it was not. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as well. So, I lost my mouse. Sorry about that. Let's talk about the current plan, or sorry, the original plan. Right. So the original plan, right, for Sentinel was that there was going to be a refurbishment of the existing silos as opposed to a rebuilding, which is what's going to be happening now. The plan as well was going to be to reuse existing cabling, the existing copper cabling from the Minuteman III. The Sentinel was supposed to be deployed with a new warhead, the W-87-1. There was supposed to be sort of healthy industry competition. This was something that the Air Force talked about a lot. That would bring down costs. We'll see what happened there. Acquisition costs were supposed to be somewhere around $77.7 million in 2020 dollar value. First flight test was supposed to be December 2023. It has not happened yet. The initial operating capability, which is when the first 20 missiles are supposed to go online, was supposed to be fiscal year 2029, and it's not going to happen. And we were told that this was necessary because the life extension of the current system, the Minuteman III, we were all told was not possible. This was something that many NGOs, including ours, as well as other folks in really across the country, as well as Congress people, were wondering, can we just life extend the existing system? Why do we have to build a brand new one? We were told it is impossible to do this. And I'm basically quoting any number of officials that said exactly those words. Let's see where we're at now. We have to reconstruct the silos instead. We're going to be digging entirely new holes. We can no longer use the existing Minuteman III cabling, apparently. It seems to be fine for the Minuteman III architecture, but it's not compatible with the Sentinel, so we have to have new fiber optic cabling. That means that there's going to be increased digging, and the landowners that have leased those cables are going to, the Air Force is going to require additional easements, so they're going to make easements of an additional 100 feet for those cable lines. The Sentinel is no longer going to be deployed with the W-87-1 initially because that warhead is also delayed in a separate challenge, so we're going to be deploying it with the legacy W-87-0. There was not healthy industry competition. Their contracts were functionally single-sourced to Northrop Grumman, which we'll talk about why that happened in a bit. We are now, in terms of acquisition costs, at 81% at the latest estimate over the 2020 program baseline. The first flight test is now scheduled for March 2028, so about 4 and a bit years later than planned. IOC is also now pushed out to about 4 years. And Minuteman III is actually, turns out it was possible the whole time. It is in fact going to be life extended to at least 2050. This was something that advocates had asked for, called for, at least a study of whether or not this would be possible back in 2018, 2017, when this program was being discussed and we were told this was not possible. So how do we get here? Right, so a bunch of things, right? So the first thing that I want to highlight is that during the early years of the procurement process, the Pentagon conducted these cost comparisons, right? And the cost comparisons, this is a natural part of the life cycle of a major program. And they did a cost comparison of building an entirely new system from scratch, which became the Sentinel, versus the cost of extending the current Minuteman III. And what they ended up with was they basically said, these two things actually cost the same, like roughly the same, and the Sentinel is actually cheaper. And to, I think, folks that were sort of watching this, that doesn't really make any sense. Like, that's a very counterintuitive finding, because how could building an entirely new thing from scratch be cheaper than the cost of life extending something that already exists in the ground? Basically, what happened is that the Pentagon, when they were doing their cost assessment, they pegged those assumptions to deploying the same number of ICBMs as they currently are, 400, up to the year 2075. And the year 2075 is a really important number because that number is not written down in any national security document. It's not like the US has developed at least a public strategy to have a certain level of readiness by 2075. The year 2075 was sort of plucked out of thin air as far as I can understand. And what that means is basically they, because it is likely not possible to extend the Minuteman III up to 2075 because they don't have enough airframes to do so. The cost comparison when they're looking at the Minuteman III was judging how much it would cost to life extend and then begin the process of building a follow-on system from scratch. So it was really comparing the cost of building a new Sentinel right now versus the cost of life extending and then building a new Sentinel afterwards. And that's how you end up with these two costs that don't really make sense together. And we have some like documentation that we don't have in here, but we can talk about afterwards as well. So it's also particularly troubling that there were very few or independent government-sponsored analyses to interrogate those flawed assumptions. And so there were opportunities to do this, right? There were congressional amendments to the National Defense Bill that were being put forward by lawmakers. Those were very heavily lobbied against by industry, did not end up working. The Pentagon did contract to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in 2022, and they said, why don't you study this? And they did, and they put together a great report. But the report acknowledges basically this was done on very short notice. We did not have access to classified materials, and so we have to go based on what the Pentagon says. And the Pentagon said, they gave us these requirements. If those are indeed the requirements, then I suppose Sentinel is the only option. But they sort of, the report really sort of indicates that they were not given access to the full suite of information that would allow them to come to a different decision. And so what I think is really clear here is that there was not really a study that was looking at what are the different possible ways in which we could save money, right? Like maybe under a range of scenarios, right? So let's benchmark it to 2050, to 2060, to 2075 and see how things change. Maybe we don't need to deploy 400 ICBMs. Maybe we go down to 300. How does that change? There wasn't really that kind of public assessment done. It was saying, we're keeping 400 ICBMs until 2075. Which option is now cheaper? And that that sort of pre-bakes the analysis a little bit. Additionally, there was really an institutional failure to predict the true costs and needs of the program. And so I mentioned in the previous slide that there were these challenges with the cabling and the reusing of the launch infrastructure. So these were things that we were told we would be able to keep using. Those are now not happening, right? So there's going to have to be changes that are going to have to, like more digging that has to happen, more easements, that sort of thing. So there was just like a failure to predict this. And then on top of that, there was just like really a lot of overconfidence in the ability of both the Air Force and Northrop Grumman to deliver on time and on budget, right? So because there were all of these concerns, you'd think that there would be perhaps better communication or something like that, but we've learned through testimony since then in Congress that basically the various reports, the benchmarks, things that had to be delivered to Congress were not at a level of maturity needed to advance the program. So for example, in the defense acquisition process, there's something called the Milestone B report. This basically is sort of the official start of a program and advances it to the engineering and manufacturing development stage. The Milestone B is like an incredibly critical decision point because this is really when decisions get made about whether to advance it or whether to stop in the tracks. And the Milestone B is very optimistic about what is possible. And since then, we've now seen this 81% cost increase, like many years being pushed back. Like basically every assumption that went into it has been flawed and has now needed to be changed. And so there was this overconfidence in what was possible. And what we saw from quotations at the time, we had very senior Air Force officials say they had, quote, godlike insight into this program, right? Or that everything was running on schedule, right? So just like this real confidence that this was going to be possible. And that just isn't the case, right? So in addition, we also had the Air Force being very delayed in putting together an integrated master schedule, which is sort of like unnecessary for program development. This is something that you're supposed to have 6 months after your Milestone B. That did not happen. And then if they did end up creating one, it became obsolete with the new Nunn-McCurdy decision. So just like a lot of real like serious challenges. We also saw admissions of poor communication between the Air Force and the contractor, and the Air Force eventually, they fired the colonel that was in charge of the program and replaced him with a 2-star, which sort of indicates like the need for increased attention on the program. That's like a pretty significant rank change. So, just like a lot of things that are that really helped sort of move this program forward despite the fact that it needed more scrutiny. The last thing I'll mention is sort of the non-competitive disadvantages. What we had here was, there were concerns about rising costs back in the early days of the program. And back in 2019, Air Force leaders were really confident that there would be this sort of competitive industry-wide competition to allow for costs to be kept down. And what ended up happening was, because of the conditions of the market, Northrop Grumman absorbed a large solid rocket motor company that sort of put them in pole position for competition, and then Boeing sort of pulled out of the competition. So what the Air Force did was functionally like single source this contract to Northrop Grumman. And there was not really this competition that they said would save billions of dollars. And since then, we've had quotes recently from Air Force officials say, the competition we thought that we would have in this program just didn't exist. So, a lot of challenges. And all of this, coincides with the skyrocketing costs. So let's talk about what is actually coming to North Dakota. So there's naturally going to be on-base construction, right? This at Minot. There's going to be new facilities that are going to support the Sentinel mission, including new maintenance facilities, training facilities, mock silos, new warhead storage, that sort of thing. I'll show you some satellite imagery of a few of those soon. We're also going to have the renovation. This is now like all off-base construction. We're going to have renovation and rebuilding of all of the missile alert facilities and the launch facilities. There's going to be 13 communications towers that are going to be about 300 feet tall and have a footprint of about 5 acres. I mentioned the land easements, so there's going to be sort of widening these launch corridors by about 50 feet on either side. There's going to be a new workforce hub in Minot, so that'll be about 50 to 60 acres for a few thousand residents for the next 3 to 5 years. And then we'll also have these various construction staging areas that will be a little bit smaller. Interestingly, we know from the environmental impact statement what sort of impact these things will have, and the Air Force predicts. They have these interesting charts where they show the effects of the workforce hub and the temporary workers on crime, which is something, the environmental impact statement has a lot of really interesting things in there, and it's a fantastic source for information about a program. But they sort of show, here's what we sort of project for this local area based on adding an additional 3,000 people to the population over a pretty quick period of time. And then on top of that, we have the environmental impact statement noting how will it impact residents, right? So we have these sort of short and long-term significant adverse effects on cultural resources, which they don't really define, so I'm not quite exactly sure what that means. But then we have things like public health and safety, socioeconomics because of demands on public schools, utilities and infrastructure. They talk about housing on a different slide and how rental costs are already high and they're going to increase. And then we have these other different effects on other resource areas like air quality and stuff like that based on construction. What's interesting, I think what's important to remember here as well is that these weapons are designed to be kept in the ground for the next 50, 60, 70 years, if not indefinitely, right? After Sentinel, you can imagine there will be a follow-on system to replace Sentinel, right? The US at the moment does not really have a plan to phase out ICBMs, so there will be follow-on systems unless there's a dramatic policy change that happens. And to risk stating the obvious, right, the world is going to look really different in 50, 60, 70 years. And what we find is that, nuclear-armed countries are always thinking about geostrategic changes, right, which is why they're doing these modernization programs. They're worried about what other countries are going to be building and deploying over the next 50 years. But they are rarely thinking about geophysical changes. And so what's interesting is that, in January 2019, really for the first time, the DoD put out, because of a bill in Congress, they put out this report called Effects of a Changing Climate to the Department of Defense, where they basically listed all of the vulnerable facilities to climate catastrophe in the US. And so I went through it, and 23 of them are directly related to the US nuclear mission, and 7 actually store nuclear weapons on site. And so what does that actually look like? I have this little chart here. These are the 7, I think I have 8 here because 7 store warheads on site, and then Offutt does not, but it's the home of U.S. Strategic Command. And so we have here the 3 ICBM bases, the 2 submarine bases, and Kirtland, right, which is where a lot of the warheads are stored, and then Offutt, right, the home of U.S. Strategic Command. These were the 4 categories of climate catastrophe that the report included: recurrent flooding, drought, desertification, and wildfires. You can see Minot has current flooding and potential flooding as well as drought, but you can see there's quite a change in here. What's interesting is that these 7 bases are home to almost the entirety of the U.S. nuclear arsenal, right? And so what's also really interesting is, when we look at these bases, right, this in particular is from Minot, right, but this was back in 2009. There were different times in which missiles had to be actually physically removed from their silos because of winter snowfall. The Air Force said that they have here in this same article, 41 of the sites are in areas that make them prone to runoff and draining problems. This is a great chart that my colleague Jamie Kwong, who's done some great research into this, has produced in a recent report showing this sort of Minot area and where flooding can occur in different parts of North Dakota. And as well, we have here, this is out at Vandenberg in the same report. There was a big wildfire in 2016, burned over 10,000 acres and came pretty close to a Space Launch Complex. Vandenberg is where they're testing the infrastructure for Sentinel right now, so this has direct implications for the program. And despite the fact that all of these sort of weather events are only going to increase and get worse, it doesn't really seem like there is an impetus to really interrogate that within the Department of Defense. We're sort of just proceeding as if this stuff is not happening. And when we think about how the geography and the climate is going to change in this particular area over the next 50 years, we're going to see a lot more flooding. We're going to see a lot more extreme weather events, but we are putting increasingly expensive missiles into the exact same holes in the ground as they were before, right? So what does that, it does raise some questions about how forward thinking this posture and this strategy is. So some future challenges, right, and staying up to date. For all of us in this room and folks watching online, it's going to be important for us to keep up to date with what's going on with this program. So DoD is preparing a new milestone B, which is that sort of that very important document, the program assessment. They have to prepare a new one because the Nunn-McCurdy breach meant that the DoD rescinded the first milestone B. So now they have to prepare a new one. We don't know when that's going to come out. It will likely require a Freedom of Information Act request to get it. That was how we got the first one. And so if you want to read the first one, it's in a report that we just put out a couple months ago. It's included in the appendix of that report, and we released it there. The Air Force also began preparing a supplemental environmental impact statement this summer. We also don't know when that's going to be released. It's also a little bit unclear what the status is because the administration just rolled back several provisions of the National Environmental Policy Act. And so I don't really know how that's going to, what the interplay between those things is going to be. Hopefully we still get that statement because there's going to be a lot of new information relating to all of the new construction that's happening with Sentinel. We're also going to use Freedom of Information Act requests, declassification requests, and contract watching. And the last thing that I'll talk about before we sort of wrap up here is about satellite imagery. This is something we use a lot in our work to see what is going on at different sites. So for example, this is something that we put together last year. This is the missile test site out at Vandenberg. And so this is where they are doing a lot of really interesting construction. You can see the silo lid right there. We've sort of highlighted it. And the lid track where the lid sort of goes like that, and then the missile flies out. What's interesting is this image is from 2023, and this is what the rendered graphic, this is a rendered graphic from Northrop Grumman, and you can see here that at the time it had this thing that says reclaimed Minuteman III facilities and then new GBSD, which is the old name for Sentinel, the new GBSD facilities. And you can see that there's this black grayish part of the Minuteman III facilities. What my colleague Mackenzie Knight Boyle found is that Northrop Grumman in February of 2024, they actually replaced this graphic with a new one. And that shows that there is no longer any reclamation of the previous Minuteman III facilities because they are going to be digging out entirely new silos. And we can see how that corresponds to the new satellite imagery. So right here, May 2023, that's what that previous image is. October 2024, construction starts to look a lot different, starts to have a much bigger footprint. You're seeing like this whole sort of shelter on top of the silo, and then here we have a much larger area. So it's entirely possible that this sort of initial working in May 2023, that construction, where they're sort of looking at the original facility, is sort of what led to these changes where they said, oh, you know what, actually, we actually can't reclaim the Minuteman III facilities. We're going to have to change a lot more. And then so we started to see the change in graphics and bigger construction. And so when you multiply this by 450, you have a lot of additional costs that gets associated. And here's the new graphic there. Additionally, we can see some new things that are going to get put out. So this is at Warren, because Warren is the first base where things are going to be changing. It goes Warren, then Malmstrom, and then Minot is last. So there is a new weapons generation facility, which is going to be where all the warheads are housed. They've been building this now for the past few years. It looks like it's basically finished now. That's kind of what it looks like out front. And then you can see what Malmstrom has over here. They're just in the process of building it. So they're about halfway through now. Minot's has not started yet. So, but you will see something like this be happening at Minot over the next few years or so. What's additionally interesting is this is from the environmental impact statement. The Air Force puts out these very helpful things where they say, okay, here is Minot Air Force Base. Here are all the new things we're planning on building, right? And they put these little stars. So when you see, if you're looking at satellite imagery, and I'm more than happy to talk through offline, you know, how we can go about doing that, it's free. When you go through and look at the satellite imagery, you might see, oh, I'm seeing construction like over here. I don't know what it is. This is at least the proposed facility site that the Air Force has put out for that. So it sort of helps you get a sense of what's going on. And then some additional resources, we can talk through some things as well offline, but Princeton University and Scientific American put out this fantastic website called Missiles on Our Land. It comes with this great sort of interactive webpage called Under the Nuclear Cloud, where you can go through and see not only how nuclear impact on those sites, what sort of impact that would have for where you're living or other places, but it also shows the different town halls that have taken place so that people have been able to give their comments on what's been going on with the program. I mentioned this report that includes the milestone B via our FOIA that we have here. There's also Sentinel environmental impact statements, and then there's a few other folks who have done some really great work here. But I'll leave it there for now. I'm really looking forward to questions. We can just open this up to a conversation, and thank you all so much. Yeah.
Matt, so I noticed 81% cost overrun is kind of what they're estimating right now. What is that in terms of dollars? Like how much taxpayer money are we talking about here?
Yeah, so when it comes to dollars, it's a little challenging because we always have to use the correct dollar value because the DoD will sometimes use, they'll peg it to a particular base year, or they'll use then year dollars, which sort of accounts for inflation. And so when you compare the two, you'll end up with like a very strange cost overrun. But in terms of at least that base year 2020, the 81% increase gets you to about 100. I think it was like 144 million or something. That's just in the acquisition costs. So that does not include the maintenance over the lifetime of the missile, the sustainment, the staffing costs. The only things that the acquisition cost actually refers to is the cost to build the missile and like the R&D, the military construction associated with it, and then the disposal. Actually, no, it does not include disposal. So it's literally just like those very early things, and then there's going to be a lot more over the lifetime of the program that I believe CRS, like the Congressional Research Service, they, I think, have done the most recent digging into the numbers, and I can show you the reporting after. Yeah.
Just a quick follow-up. So how much do we spend on our nuclear program? in the United States?
Oh,
like just
great question.
overall. So the overruns, that's one thing, but I mean, I really don't even know how much we're spending on the program in general.
Yeah, great question. So where we are likely at, right, if you take all of the modernization, right, for not just the ICBMs, but the submarines, just everything, wrap it all up together, over the next 30 years, the projection is it's going to be somewhere in the realm of like $1.5 trillion. Yeah.
Sorry for not using this earlier. I have three questions that all kind of go into one, Matt. You talked about flooding of silos. This might be kind of silly. There are many, many thousands of ground squirrels at the Minot Air Force Base too. And I'm curious also, like, what stops a warhead from going off? Like, if the facility is flooded, if rodents chew into wiring, I have no idea. What kind of safety measures are in place to prevent one of these going off in a vast rural area?
Yeah, it's a great question, a fair question. When it comes to preventing these things from going off, that's something that that doesn't make me lose sleep at night, right? Like there are a number of checks and balances within the Air Force itself, right? Like down to the Launch Control Center, where you have to have multiple people turning keys. There's like a whole checklist of things. The weapons have to be unlocked. It's like quite a large endeavor that takes a lot of time and authorization. So it's when I bring up the flooding, or when you bring up the squirrels, like things like that, what I'm not worried about is that the missile goes off, right? What I am worried about is that there is a substantial cost that happens when a missile is sort of taken out of operation, in which it becomes basically, due to flooding, it's either difficult to access the facility, and then there's potentially you have a security challenge there, or you need to do some kind of maintenance, and the maintenance itself is incredibly costly, and so you're adding on a lot more cost to this program, the cost of which will ultimately be borne by people who live in the area and US taxpayers. So it's more of a, when we think about the future of climate change in this area, right, the cost projections that we see are absolutely not accounting for the fact that this area is going to be flooding increasingly more in the future, and we're going to have more missiles being likely pulled out of silos. There are going to have to be additional things that have to happen to keep them dry and safe, and that's all going to add additional cost to this. So it does sort of beg the question, okay, if we were to redesign the US nuclear deterrent from scratch in a way that's like cost effective and still secure and safe and accomplishes deterrence objectives, are ICBMs the best way to go? I don't know, right? Like that's a question for policy people.
And one more, Matt. What's the timeline for the Minot area? What are we going to see, and how long will it last?
Yeah, so Minot, I mentioned, is the last base to receive these upgrades. The reason why is because they're basically starting with the bases that are most geographically connected to big infrastructure and cities. So they're starting with Warren because it's very close to Cheyenne, and they're basically trying to say, we'll work out the kinks at Warren first, and then Malmstrom, and then we'll go to the most remote base, which is Minot, and then hopefully by then we'll have figured it all out and we'll do it way cheaper. So we're likely to see the majority of the missiles actually changing over at Minot in the 2030 time period. I don't think anything is likely to happen here before 2030. Because we only now have just seen the first missile silo get sort of taken offline from Minuteman, and that's out in, it's a silo out in Wyoming. So, and the way that they've sort of done this is they're thinking in terms of, I think, thank you, 3 to 5 year time periods for each one. Yeah?
I do have a question for you.
Oh, yes.
Is it okay?
Should I get this back?
Yeah, are we sharing?
Of course. Yeah, we can share.
Your microphone went out, so we'll pass it back around.
Great.
Well, Jack stole my main question there with that timeline. But the other question I had was, we're 8 months into a new administration, and you mentioned already that there are a couple things that FAS is kind of monitoring because they don't know where it's going to go. Is FAS anticipating a significant nuclear policy shift under the new administration? And does that put any of these, long-term plans at risk?
Great question. Thank you. Yeah, that's a great question. it is so challenging to think that through, because I think particularly because of the, I'll call it like the eccentricities of this administration in particular. But what we have seen is that over many years, there has really not been that much change between administrations, right? Like when we think of this whole modernization program that I talked about, that actually was codified under the Obama administration, right? It was then continued basically by the first Trump administration. There were a couple of things that were added on. The Biden administration has continued it. They continued it as well. They, sort of tried to tweak a couple things around the margins, but largely the contours remain the same. I would imagine that likely things will just stay the same because of a few reasons, right? One is that there is really, I think, not a tremendous appetite for changing nuclear posture really significantly because one, there is a lot of money at stake, right? And we cannot ignore the industry influences on nuclear policy, just like we can't ignore it in any industry. Additionally, when it comes to nuclear policy, there are so many people watching what the U.S. is doing. And I don't just mean like us in this room. I mean U.S. allies and U.S. adversaries. And there is kind of the first question that comes out of everyone's mouth, when you're a nuclear war planner or when you're a policymaker and someone says, hey, let's, drop down the number of ICBMs or let's, knock a submarine off to save some costs. The first question is always, how are the allies going to perceive that? What's China going to think? What's Japan going to think, right? And these are questions that I think are real, right? They're important to think through. I think, personally, I think that there are ways that the U.S. can meet its deterrence requirements by going down to a smaller number of ICBMs, really, really rethinking the ICBM mission in general because of some of the things we talked about today. But it's really difficult to change nuclear policy, even with an administration that's willing to push boundaries like this one. It would really surprise me if we saw them come out and say, yes, Sentinel is really over budget and we listed it in the fact sheet and we're going to cancel it. Like that, I don't think that is going to happen. But certainly we could see sort of things that come out rhetorically that are really different than what we've seen in the past. So we'll be watching for that.
Follow up on that?
Yeah.
Same vein with the war in Ukraine and the technological advancements in modern military strategy. At what point does this traditional kind of nuclear triad become outdated? I mean, we've had it for a long time, and how quickly does technology need to move for these long-term projects to be rendered not necessarily useless, but behind the times?
Yeah, it's a good question. That's why. Well, certainly, I think a real challenge, and this sort of came up a little bit during the presentation, but these weapon systems get built on incredibly long timelines, right? So the Sentinel, we first started hearing, it wasn't called the Sentinel first. It was, it was called the Ground-Based Strategic Deterrent, and before that, it was called something else, right? But people were thinking about a follow-on system for the Minuteman III 20, 25 years ago. And there are probably people out there who are already probably thinking about the follow-on system for the Sentinel, right? So the challenge is that these things clearly take a really long time to build because, we've had 25 years of thinking about this and it's still behind schedule. And so it's really challenging to think about a paradigm that does not involve just sticking with the current nuclear triad, because if you are someone who is tasked with figuring out, okay, what is the next iteration of U.S. nuclear strategy? The system sort of functions through inertia, which is this particular weapon system becomes outdated. It reaches the end of its service life. All right, we need a new one that does basically the same thing, but with some tweaked requirements. It's really rare that you'll get this holistic conversation about, okay, here are all the systems in our arsenal, and having kind of a national conversation about, okay, well, you know what, maybe this particular mission does not really make sense anymore. For example, the ICBMs, which are really this sort of relic of the Cold War in particular. But there's so much inertia, and the things take so long to build that it really causes a problem for people who want to think about a different pathway. And so there's this it's I forget I think maybe it's like a Mark Fisher thing or something, but it's something about like not being able to see beyond the waters that we're swimming in because it just is all around us, right? Like it's impossible to think of a new thing. And if you were to put pen to paper and say like, the optimal U.S. deterrence system is like 10 submarines, no ICBMs, and like some bombers or something like that, which people have done. It's incredibly challenging to think of a way that we get from where we are today to that reality because of all of these different factors. And I think a lot of things would have to change about the U.S. system of government and policymaking in order to do that, right? Like, you would have to have a Congress that really wants to exercise its what its constitutionally held power is, which is to like make decisions about what to fund, whereas right now they seem mostly very content with just deferring to whatever the military wants. And also you would need to have really different incentives for how laws get made and how programs get funded. And right now it's very industry forward. And so that sort of lends to this natural push towards always building more. Yeah.
Do you have to do anything special to get them to comply with your Freedom of Information Act requests? Like, I imagine that they don't serve all this information up to you readily. Like, have you had to bully them a little bit? Like, how do you get the Department of Defense to get you all of this information?
So, thank you. Yeah, good question. So, in my experience, I found like the FOIA officers across the DoD and at different places at state, energy, to be largely like very helpful. It really depends on the individual officer because they know the law quite well, and you have to also know the law quite well in order to like sometimes you do have to push back a little bit. So occasionally we've gotten back responses that say, we are not going to give you this document because it's not in the interests of the United States. And it's like, that is not the law. Like that is not an acceptable response to the FOIA request. So please show me exactly in the law where this information is being classified. In addition, you do sort of have to occasionally push sometimes and say, okay, you can't classify an entire document unless you can prove that every single piece of this is intended to be classified, right, and does not fall under some of these particular exemptions. Then you still have to release the document, but certain things can be blacked out and stuff like that. So sometimes there is a little bit of a back and forth. Generally, I found in my experience just like having a relationship with a FOIA officer and just being, friendly and respectful and being like, here's what I'm looking for, we know that like this is what we're entitled to. Of course, like there are national security exemptions, and so like if things have to be classified, then that's okay. But like you sort of have to work with them a little bit. And of course, like I have not had to do this in my career, but there are options that you can take that are like legal options where you can work with various law firms who will do that sort of work for you and with you, and you can appeal and that sort of thing. And it's more of like a litigation. I just haven't gone through that process because we've managed to get most of what we've asked for. Like the milestone B, it took a long time, but like we got the whole thing. Yeah.
I want to follow up on the cost thing because our congressional delegation is trying to push Congress to have all the bases done at the same time, saying it's a cost-saving move. And I know they're really pushing that in Minot because Minot is very pro-project. What do you think the opportunity or the chances are that they're going to succeed on that?
Wow. I think that would be really difficult to do, just based on where the program is at right now. I don't see. It's challenging to think through like how the program is at a stage of maturity right now where that kind of thing would be possible. I think they are really just working out the kinks right now. Like the quotes that we're getting, from the Air Force, it's just sort of the tenor of how people are talking about the program still seems very much in the vein of, we are still figuring out what we have to do on one silo. to make this work, let alone doing all 450 at once. My guess is I think that would be really challenging. But who knows?
So it kind of picks up on some of the other questions, but the long scale that we're doing these projects on, we can't see the world 50 years from now. And I'm just thinking in the last 10 years, 15 years, cyber and AI and all these different things. Is there a chance that, cyber warfare and AI could, eclipse a nuclear deterrent as being more of a deterrent? And then also kind of, this might sound like a joke, but is there a Skynet contingency with all this? If you know what I mean by that.
Right. Yeah. All right. I'm gonna try my best to not predict Skynet nuclear war. Yeah. But okay, there are a few things in there, right? So one is that this actually has been a discussion, right, amongst folks in the Air Force and also just outside, right, which is that the current technology, right, the Minuteman III technology, is all like mostly mechanical, right? Like there's computers, but they're like 1960s era computers, right? So they cannot be hacked, right? It's like trying to hack a jukebox, right? Like you can't eat, right? Like hacking a jukebox or like a typewriter, right? Like it doesn't work. These new systems, they're all going to be networked, right? The Air Force is saying, obviously, like, it's in their interest to make these things incredibly safe and secure. And so, I take them at their word, right, that they are going to be putting in lots of, they're going to be putting in lots of safeguards to make sure that, like, these things can't be hacked. But you obviously introduce a level of, like, an additional threat vector, like an attack surface when you are networking systems like this. So that is a challenge. When we think about like AI and cyber warfare, things like that, my general take on this is that I think that those things have the potential to sort of multiply the threat, like the existing threats of nuclear war, but they may not necessarily cause nuclear war in and of themselves, right? Like I think that, for example, a real challenge that we have right now is that the president has an extremely short amount of time to make a decision about whether to launch nuclear weapons in the midst of a crisis, right? This is like they get like 15 minutes basically, right? Especially when it comes to the ICBM force. Because because they are on a what folks might call like a use it or lose it posture, right? They are sitting in the middle of the country. Everyone knows where they are. Adversaries know where they are. They have probably calculated exactly how many nuclear weapons it takes to knock one out. And so you're in a situation in which if there is a nuclear crisis, the president might say, we are getting word that we think a country is about to knock out our nuclear silos, so, like I'm going to shoot first, right? In order to not lose the capability to retaliate really quickly. This doesn't happen with submarines, for example, because submarines are out in the ocean. They're invulnerable as far as we know. And so you don't have that like time crunch. When we get to the AI and cyber part of your question, right? AI has the potential, or cyber, warfare has the potential to maybe shrink those launch windows even further, right? Because of misinformation, disinformation that gets injected into the system, and so there are, I guess, the solutions to that in my mind are not AI and cyber related, they're nuclear related, right? It's about maybe changing our posture around so that we don't need to rely on ICBMs as much, right? So that we can transition away from things that require this use it or lose it posture into a posture that still has a strong deterrent effect, but does not like accidentally propel us into nuclear conflict. And so like the cyber and AI parts, they have the potential risk of injecting like uncertainty and disinformation into an already very unpredictable type of crisis. But fundamentally, it's still a nuclear crisis, and the solution to that should be a nuclear one. That's my perspective.
I've got two questions. One is there a particular reason the Minuteman III missile needs to be replaced in the first place? And the second question is there currently a plan or a thought of a plan for what's going to happen to the existing silos, the existing missiles, once they're eventually replaced, whenever that might be?
So here, I'll take them in reverse order. So my understanding, although this is still getting like worked out and publicized and very slowly, so we're still kind of figuring this out. My understanding is that the locations will largely be the same, right? So we sort of saw on that satellite imagery, it's just a larger construction footprint within the same existing facility like complex. And so we'll have old parts that will get decommissioned and discarded, but it's not like we'll have an empty launch facility that's just like sitting out in a farm somewhere. Whereas and there will be a new one like 50 feet from it. I think it'll all be kind of wrapped up in the same facility, if that makes sense. Does that answer the second part of your question?
Yes.
Okay. So then the first part of your question, why did we need Sentinel? It's a great question. This is like the $200 billion question. Right? What we were told, right, during a period of really intense scrutiny on the ICBM force, especially around 2018, 2019, because that was right before the Milestone B happened, right? The Milestone B came out in 2020, right? And the big contract was awarded to Northrop Grumman in September 2020. So up until 2020 was like the height of scrutiny on this program for a while, at least until now. And a lot of people right out in the open source, myself included, were wondering why can we not just stick with Minuteman III, right? What is it about Minuteman III that doesn't work anymore? And what we were told by the Air Force was basically, there are a few things. One is they wanted Sentinel to have some new capabilities, which we don't exactly know what that means, but probably like a little bit better range, maybe just like some things like bringing them up to today's standards of electronics and guidance, like a cyber capability, things like that, just like a little bit more advanced, which is, makes sense because the military always wants new things. So that is not surprising. But on top of that, they were saying that the Minuteman III cannot be life extended anymore, right? These were systems that came in the 1970s. They were, at that point, about 50 years old. They were many years past their original service lives. That being said, service lives are very squishy, right? And we have seen instances in which service lives of weapons have been dictated not by the military or not by the people who built them, but by Congress, right? Because Congress wanted a new system, and they will say, you know what? The new service life of this system is actually 10 years earlier than it was supposed to be because we say so, right? There are times when service lives have been changed for political reasons. And so that did actually happen with the Minuteman III, right? The original service life was supposed to be 2040. Then Congress sort of moved it down to 2030. And what we were told by the Air Force was the parts for Minuteman III, many of these parts, don't actually exist anymore because the people who built them back in the 70s, they've retired, their businesses don't exist, and it would cost too much money to remake these old parts than to build an entirely new system from scratch. This is what we were told, and there were a lot of metaphors and analogies about cars and things that I don't understand about how a missile is the same as a car, and if it's better to buy a new Mercedes than continuously revamp an old jalopy or something. None of that made any sense to me, but all right, we got a lot of car analogies back in 2018, and that was kind of the a main driving reason was they said this just wasn't possible anymore. Now we know that they are actually going to life extend some portion of this until 2050, so it was possible. Did they know that back in 2018? I don't know, but it does seem interesting that something is impossible when it's politically convenient, and then it suddenly becomes possible when it becomes a technical necessity.
We actually should need to wrap it up because he's got a time schedule, but I'm sure he'll have a few more minutes to follow up with individual questions.
Yes, I'm sticking around for a little bit so I can we can chat off camera.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for being here today. Please join me in giving him a round of applause.